Oh, that's not good for you.
Well, good evening, folks. It's nice to have you all here. For the third time now, we talked about dead people, and the first time we did the shooting
More
about
dead people.
Pearson.
Yeah.
The second time was dead people in graves, and we got 2 more dead guys tonight. So anyhow, oh, were you gonna say? No, you can just hang on for a minute. Or you want me to turn on? Oh, okay.
Do you want, it's just this one, all the way down.
Yeah. Thanks, Lori. So, as part of the program tonight, I thought I would give everybody a copy of the bibliography about Lewis and Clark. So in the event that you go home and say you want to read more about this, you can do that. Probably the most famous book that you might be familiar with is Stephen Ambrose's book called Undaunted Courage. It was a popular, very popular, still a popular book, written in 1996. And then there's others that have been written as well. And then there are also the journals of Lewis Clark, and actually you can go online and see them all. There's thousands. The journals themselves are 8,000 pages long, so you can imagine how long the transcribed copies are. But you can see the address are Lewis and Clark Journals, UNL.edu. And then there's a couple of videos that have come out on this as well, and you can see a couple web pages there. Ambrose and then Donald Dean Jackson are both the leading scholars on this business of Lewis and Clark, and James Ronda as well. And then on the back side of that page is a map of the journey. So tonight you'll see some of those places illustrated. And then the last 2 pages are we used to, the previous historical study where I worked at, we used to do Lewis and Clark demonstrations of their cooking. And so these were some of the recipes that we had. They were not recipes like you would think, well, it's a cup of this and this, and it's a pinch of this, and I'm going to read one of the recipes later for buffalo. But you can see at the bottom of the first page how much food they had to use every day or every couple days with a group of 33 people traveling across the plains. So in November of 1884, they had to shoot 32 deer, 12 elk, and 1 buffalo to get them on for a day or 2. 11 buffalo on December 7th, 1804, and then 1805, 40 deer, 3 buffalo, and 16 elk. So that's just a typical snapshot of it. In the journals, you'll see every day how much food they had. On the page after that, we used to make sourdough biscuits, and this is the recipe that we used to use, just those three lines there. So it's kind of whatever it turned out to be. But if you're interested in pursuing this farther, there is a book called The Food Journal of Lewis and Clark, and from Yankton, South Dakota, Mary Gunderson, and then, as I mentioned, Gary Bolton as well. All right, so then we'll get us started there. And as I say, if you, well, the library here, Laura was kind enough to bring these out. So these are the journals. There's 3 different versions of the report. You can sort of online version. But this is called the Thwaites version. And you can read every day, day by day. And then the maps are here. And then some of the other books, Stephen Ambrose's book is there as well. All right.
No, just down a little. Yeah, push it down all the way. There you go.
Gotcha.
Otherwise the
All right.
ghosties come.
Am I allowed to do it like
I love it. There you go.
Love it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tonight we're going to do some readings from the journals of Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, and they are the leaders of really the most famous and epic journey in American history. The journals that they wrote, of which are the actual physical journals, are still in Philadelphia and are considered to be a great masterpiece of American literature. So there's the map I mentioned. It's on your bibliography there. And it just gives you a sense of how far they traveled. And they both the whole crew of 33 people started at Camp Savoy there, which is in Missouri, or actually on the other side of the river in Illinois. But remember that Meriwether Lewis started in Washington, D.C., and William Clark got on, as you'll see in just a moment, in Clarksville, Indiana, which is right across from Louisiana. So, okay. So my own interest in all of this had its beginnings in 2008 when my late wife died, and in her memorial service, she said, "Go out and travel the country." So I took her up on it. She said that, right? And she spoke from the other side, so we did. And one of the things that I had always wanted to do was to follow in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. My family is from Montana, Helena and Billings. And so it was kind of always in the back of my mind to do this. So I did. And I drove 11,000 miles from New Jersey all the way out to the Pacific and back in an RV that was called Miss Wolf Creek, or Creek. I should say Creek. My mother used to say Creek because she was from Montana. And I don't know how many remember the book River Runs Through It, or perhaps the movie. And you'll remember the prostitute in that movie who was from Wolf Creek. This is where my mother's family and our family was from. And she was the prostitute that rode high on the horses with the skirts at the time, if you remember. Anyway, that's who my RV was named after. So that's how this program came to be. And as I said, Undaunted Courage and the journals I kept in my RV and read them every day as I was traveling. And every time I got to a spot where they had been that I could actually stand on the spot, then I could read them. In the end, I also wrote a book about it there as well. Okay, so this journey began in the summer of 1803, and the Louisiana Purchase is now announced by Thomas Jefferson. And there had been negotiations about this going on, but Thomas Jefferson and Meriwether Lewis, who was his personal secretary, had already begun to plan for this trip, even if we had not bought Louisiana Purchase in 1802. And it concludes 2.5 years later in September of 1806. And there's a great debate amongst historians are like this, but great debate amongst the Lewis and Clark historians as to when and where the expedition began. Did it begin in Pittsburgh? Did it begin at Clarksville? Did it begin across from St. Louis? But Thomas Jefferson sent out 4 different expeditions. Lewis and Clark was not the only one. And 2 of them were led by Zebulon Pike, who was a number of counties across the country named for him. But he led one to find the source of the Mississippi River and also to find the source of the Red and Arkansas rivers, which took him out to what is now Pikes Peak, where he was captured by the Spanish. If you're ever down towards Red Cloud, where I live, in Guide Rock, which is just a few miles south of Red Cloud, east of Red Cloud, there are about 10 or 15 rifle pits still there that Pike used when he was there. He dug out the ground. Now it's just a cow pasture, and the cows kind of stay away from it because they're big dips in the ground. But he did 2 of the expeditions, and so he plays an important. Both of his expeditions, curiously, were disasters. One, he got captured by the Spanish and taken to Mexico and had to come home a while after that. But he was as much as an important person in Jefferson's exploration business as Lewis and Clark were, but his name is just not as widely recognized. And the other problem is he got caught by the Spanish, so that was probably not a good thing. But anyway, all of those 4 expeditions kept extensive journals because Jefferson was a great naturalist, wanted that information. And so their efforts were documented, and you can still read all the journals of all 4 of them, even to this day. So the expedition itself, and all of them really were, I'm focused on Lewis and Clark, but they are expeditions of raw muscle, unbelievable beauty, harsh landscapes, starvation, rattlesnake bites, mosquitoes, discipline, dangerous situations. If a boat had flipped over, or if the native peoples had not provided sustenance and guidance, the commanders had been killed, this would be just a footnote to American history and not the epic moment that it would become. And it's also worth remembering, I think, that these men, and that's how Stephen Ambrose came up with this title, had this courage that was really undaunted to go out to the Pacific and come back. The expedition is successful beyond the imagination, at least from our perspective. When they got back to Washington, D.C., Clark and Lewis, they were afraid to say to Thomas Jefferson that there was no water passage route to the Pacific Ocean, or that there was no short portage either. And that was a great disappointment, although what they had done was amazing, at least as I see it. But they did not necessarily consider it 100% successful. There would be 31 men, an Indian woman, and a baby who made that trip all the way to the Pacific and back. As I said, they kept journals. They were not published until years after the expedition, which was a great disappointment to Thomas Jefferson because he wanted to see them published in his administrations, which did not happen. And even today, we're not sure how the journals were kept. It's generally thought that the two captains, the sergeants, and several enlisted men kept notes during the day. We do know that Lewis and Clark at night, or maybe sometimes every other night, transferred those notes into these beautiful red leather-bound books, placed them in sealed tin boxes so they wouldn't get wet, and carried them on the boats all the way out to the Pacific and back. And today they're at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. They are amazing documents because they tell us so much about what America and the American West looked like at that moment. And today there's still information being recovered from them, and interesting information. And we have found, or they have found over the last 15 or 20 years, any number of campsites for Lewis and Clark, which were not known about before. They provide a look into Western America, how it looked at the time. Although Native Americans had probably been there for 25,000 years before that, for American citizens coming in from the East, this was all new to them. They discovered 189 new plant species. They created a map of that whole region that had never been mapped before. And it's obviously an important history of the expedition. Well, so I have picked some of my favorite entries into the journals. There are, I mean, as you can see, there's 8 volumes there, so you can pick a lot of them. And then what I did was, as I was traveling, I took pictures of those places, and that's what you'll see tonight. So the entries are a little difficult, so if I stumble over them, it's just hard because I've left the text as they were. And sometimes their punctuation isn't good. Clark was a terrible speller. I think he spelled Sioux, like as in Sioux Indians, like 25 different ways. So, and they were both like that. There was no common dictionary yet until after they were back. And Noah Webster had not put together his book yet. And so they just kind of spelled it however it sounded and said, well, that's good for Sioux. Is S-U-U or S-O-U? And they just went on. So, oops. So this expedition is led by Meriwether Lewis, who lived from 1774 to 1809, and William Clark, who lived from 1774 to 1838. Lewis had been Thomas Jefferson's private secretary when he went into the White House, and is the more charismatic, I would say, of the two gentlemen. Lewis is a great writer. He provides wonderful descriptions every time he keeps entries. He often walked miles inland during the day, and his main job was to collect samples, make notes, and he was overseeing the entire effort. While they were both captains, the Department of War at that time would not allow two captains to jointly run an operation. So one of them had to be a second lieutenant, and that was Clark. Clark and Lewis never told the men that. They both, all the men presumed they were both captains until the very end. When Lewis and Clark got back 2.5 years later, there were papers here that said, "Oh, William Clark is a captain," which was, of course, over, but that's what happened. Meriwether Lewis suffered from depression, and so some of his notes either don't survive, or as some have speculated, he never kept notes because he just was too depressed. And yet he led this expedition every day for 2.5 years through some incredibly dangerous times. William Clark is probably the more grounded of the two. He is the one who takes care of the boats being on the river, whether it be the boats up until they get to North Dakota or the dugout canoes from that on. And very interestingly, at least to me as a historian, is that Clark had been Lewis's commander there on a frontier post. They both known each other long before this expedition, but they were the perfect match for each other. And it is one of the things that fascinated me most as I was on this trip. So the first thing I'm going to read is the exchange of letters between Clark and Lewis to get this expedition underway. And one starts on June 19th, 1803. It's to William Clark from Meriwether Lewis. And he says, "From the long and uninterrupted friendship and confidence which has subsisted between us, I feel no hesitation in making the following communication. My plan is to descend the Ohio in a keeled boat, thence up the Mississippi to the mouth of the Missouri, and up that river as far as its navigation is practical with a keeled boat, and there to prepare canoes of bark or rawhides and proceed to its source, and if practical, pass over the waters of the Columbia or Oregon River, and then by descending it, reaching the Western Ocean. Thus, my friend, you have a summary of the plan, the means and objects of this expedition. If therefore there is anything under those circumstances in this enterprise which would induce you to participate with me in its fatigues, its dangers, and its honors, believe me, there is no man on earth whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing them as with yourself, Meriwether Lewis." The mail was slow in those days, so it's not until July 29th that William Clark responds. And in fact, Meriwether Lewis had already picked a subordinate in case Clark didn't get back for him. So it took so long for the mails to get back and forth. And so this is now on July 29th to Meriwether Lewis. The enterprise, etc., is such as I have long anticipated and am pleased with, and as my situation in life will admit in my absence the length of time necessary to accomplish such an undertaking, I will cheerfully join you in an official character as mentioned in your letter, and partake of the dangers, difficulties, and fatigues, and I anticipate the honors and rewards as a result of such an enterprise. This is an undertaking freighted with many difficulties, but my friend, I do assure you that no man lives with whom I would prefer to undertake such a trip as himself. So that gives you the context of their friendship and their relationship before all this started. So when I did my trip, the river, the Ohio, the Missouri, and the Mississippi, to some degree, look as they did as they traveled, although they're the Missouri and the Mississippi and the Ohio now all are dammed and controlled in various ways. So they don't look quite as wild as they did when those Clark were, but you can get a good sense of what it must have been like. They travel on those rivers for more than 8,000 miles and over the mountains. They will begin near St. Louis and go to the Pacific, back. Most of that distance they're traveling on water, and almost half of it is going upstream against America's most powerful rivers. The current was coming against them at 5 to 7 miles per hour, and that sounds like very slow, but it's not if you're trying to pull a boat up against it. River travel was dangerous. The men were pulling a keel boat that is the size of a semi-tractor trailer, to give you a relative size of it, and 2 pirogues, which are very large rowboats. And if you want to see one or a sample of one, go to Nebraska City to the Lewis and Clark Center there, and you can see what a pirogue looks like they've reproduced. So we come in on June 9th, 1804. The expedition's been on the Mississippi and the Missouri. And this is on, as I said, the 9th of June. It was a Saturday. Set out early, water very swift, got fast on the log, detained us a quarter hour. Heard rain last night. The current exceedingly strong. The stern of the boat struck a log, which was not perceivable in the current. Struck her bow and turned the boat against some drift and snags, which were below with great force. And those are the snags you're describing. This was a very disagreeable and dangerous situation, particularly as immense large trees were drifting down, and we lay immediately in their course. Some of our men, being prepared for all situations, leaped into the river, swam ashore with a rope, and fixed themselves in such situations that the boat was off in a few minutes. I can say with confidence that our party is not inferior to any that was ever on the waters of the Mississippi. We crossed to an island camp at William Clark. By the way, he spelled Mississippi Missoppie. So just to give you, but this is common of what they're seeing on Mississippi. So the Corps makes its way up the Missouri, and they come to the Great Plains, which no one back east had really ever seen. These views, like this one here, was seen by the first time by citizens of the United States. I have to make that clear because the native peoples have been there for more than 20,000 years, and we're well acquainted with the beauty and the awesome geography. So we come in on Captain Clark, who is describing the Great Plains. It's July 4th. That was then a major holiday in the American calendar. And to give you some context and perspective, we're only 27 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. So it's a very important day for them. July 4th, it's Wednesday, 1804, set out early past the mouth of the bayou leading from a lake on the starboard side. This lake is large and was once the bend of a river. It reaches parallel for several miles, came to the leeward side to dine and rest a short time. A snake bit Joe Fields on the side of his foot, which swelled much. We applied barks to the wound, pass a creek on the leeward side about 15 yards wide, coming out to an extensive prairie. As this creek has no name, we call it Independence Creek. And above this creek, there is woodland about 200 yards back of those woods, and an extensive prairie, open and high, which is here, and which may be seen 6 or 7 miles below. Saw great numbers of goslings today, nearly grown. And the last mentioned prairie I call Joe Fields Snake Prairie. Captain Lewis walked on the shore, saw a large mound and 3 roads leading out. We camped in the plain of one of the most beautiful plains I ever saw, beautifully diversified with hills and valleys, all presenting themselves to the river, covered with grass and a few scattering of trees. Meandering through at this place, the Kansas Indians, some formerly lived here and had a very large town. The scenery, by the variety of flowers, delicately and highly flavored, raised above the grass, which strikes and perfumes the sensation and amuses the mind, throws it into conjecturing the cause of so magnificent scenery in a country thus situated, far removed from the civilized world, to be enjoyed by nothing but the buffalo, elk, deer, and bear, in which it abounds, savage Indians. We close the day by a discharge from our bow piece and with an extra gill of whiskey. Also gives you some sense of what they thought about the native peoples as well. As they come out onto the plains, they see huge herds of buffalo. On one occasion, they counted 10,000 buffalo crossing the river stream. The meat of this animal became a staple of their trip. And we come on, this is one of the funniest, I think, journal entries, because we come on Meriwether Lewis, who's discussing how buffalo was prepared for eating. And this recipe, I wish I could get this condensed into a way that we could cook it, but I think you'll want to. May 9th, 1805, Captain Clark killed 2 bucks and 2 buffalo. I also killed 1 buffalo, which proved to be the best meat. It was in tolerable order. We saved the best of the meat, and from the cow I killed, we saved the necessary materials for making what our right-hand cook Charbonneau, that's Toussaint Charbonneau, the husband of calls the Baudin Blanc, and immediately set him about preparing them for supper. This white pudding we all esteem one of the greatest delicacies of the forest. It may not be amiss, therefore, to give it a place, meaning in the journal. About 6 feet of the lower extremity of the large gut of the buffalo is the first morsel that the cook makes love to. And this he holds fast at one end with his right hand, while with the forefinger and thumb of the left, he gently compresses it and discharges what he says is not good to eat, but of which in the sequel, we all get a moderate portion. The muscle lying underneath the shoulder blade next to the back, and fillets or neck sawed. These are kneaded up very fine with a good portion of kidney suet. And to this composition is then added a just proportion of pepper and salt and a small quantity of flour. And thus far advanced, our skillful operator, Charbonneau, seizes his receptacle, which has never once touched the water, for that would entirely destroy the regular order of the whole procedure. You will not forget that the side you now see is covered with a good coat of fat, provided the animal is in good order. The operator seizes the receptacle, I say, and tying it fast at one end, turns it inwards and begins now with repeated evolutions of the hand and arm with a brisk motion of the finger and thumb to put in what he says is bon pour bonjour. Thus, by stuffing and compressing, he soon distends the receptacle to the utmost limits of its power of expansion. And in the course of the operation, its longitudinal progress, it derives from the other end of the receptacle a much larger portion of material than was previously discharged by the finger and thumb of the left hand in the former part of the operation. Thus, when the sides of the receptacle are skillfully exchanged, the outer for the inner, and all was completely filled with something good to eat, it is tied at the other end, but not any cut off, for that would make the pattern too scant. It is then baptized in the Missouri with 2 dips and a flirt, and bobbed into the kettle, from whence, after it all is well boiled, it is taken and fried with bear's oil until it becomes brown, when it's ready to assuage the pangs of a keen appetite, for such as travelers in the wilderness are seldom at a loss for. Meriwether Lewis. So they move westward, and now they're into Montana. They go through Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, the Dakotas, and they see America in this amazing, awesome era. And in June 1805, they arrive at the Great Falls in Montana. The native peoples had told them that they could not take these falls with their dugout canoes, that they would have to portage around them. And so for the first time, Meriwether Lewis, now who's leading ahead of everyone, comes to the Great Falls. And this is what they looked like when Meriwether Lewis got there. It was one of these moments when he wrote about the monumental beauty, wrote really lyrically about it. And I actually stood at the exact same spot where this picture is, which is where Lewis standing. It's not one falls, it's a series of 5 falls. They would have the portage around them, and it would be one of the most difficult chapters of the whole trip. But with just a little bit of imagination, in the next slide, you'll see how it's changed since then. But this is what Meriwether Lewis saw. So he writes on Thursday, June 13th, 1805. I had proceeded on this course about 2 miles with Goodrich, one of the men in the expedition, at some distance behind me, when my ears were saluted with the agreeable sound of the fall of water, and advancing a little further, I saw the spray arise above the plain like a column of smoke, which would frequently disappear again in an instant, caused by, I presume, the wind, which blew pretty hard from the southwest. I did not, however, lose my direction to this point, which soon began to make a roaring too tremendous to be mistaken for any cause short of the great falls of Missouri. Here I arrived at 12 o'clock, having traveled by estimate about 15 miles, remember, all on foot. I hurried down the hill, which was about 200 feet high, difficult to access, to gaze upon the sublimely grand spectacle. I took my position on the top of some rocks about 20 feet high opposite the center of the falls. From the reflection of the sun on the spray or mist which arises from these falls, there is a beautiful rainbow which adds not a little to the beauty of this majestically grand scenery. And after writing this imperfect description, I again viewed the falls and was so much disgusted with the imperfect idea which it conveyed of the scene that I determined to draw my pen across it and begin again, but then reflected that I could not perhaps succeed better than penning the first impressions of my mind. After sitting there being impressed by this, he writes, "My fare is really sumptuous this evening. Buffaloes hump, tongues, marrow bones, fine trout, parched meal, pepper and salt, and a good appetite. The last is not considered the least of these luxuries." And this is what it looks like today. All 5 of those falls have been dammed. They're all water powered, with generation power, but you can see how that's changed the Great Falls. They were there. If you're ever in Great Falls, Montana, go to the United States Forest Service's Lewis and Clark Museum there. It's an amazing museum of all these great disciplines. So there's only a couple places left today, from Pittsburgh to the Pacific, that Lewis and Clark would immediately recognize as places that they had seen. All the rivers have changed courses, they've been dammed, homes have been built along the banks of the rivers. And of course, cities have sprouted up on plots of land where there were just a few native people living at those times. And the Gates of the Mountains, just north of Helena, Montana, is a place of really spectacular beauty. And one of the places where I actually got on the water and followed in their footsteps. So we come in on Captain Lewis's entry for the day, and the Corps of Discovery has passed through the first of 5 ranges of the Rocky Mountains. Friday, July 9th, 1805, the mosquitoes are very troublesome as usual. This morning we set out early and proceeded on very well, though water appears to increase in velocity as we advance. The current has been strong all day and obstructed with some rapids, though these are but little broken by rocks and are perfectly safe. The river deep and from 100 to 150 yards wide. I walked along the shore today and killed antelope. Wherever we get a view of the lofty summits of the mountains, the snow presents itself, although we are almost suffocated in this valley confined with heat. The pine and cedar balsam fir grow on the mountains in regular assemblages or spots, mostly high up on their sides. And this evening we entered much the remarkable cliffs that we have yet seen, and that's here. These cliffs rise from the water's edge on either side perpendicularly to the height of about 1,200 feet, and each object here wears a dark, gloomy aspect. From a singular appearance at this place, I call it the gates of the Rocky Mountains. The mountains higher today than yesterday. Some saw bighorns and a few antelopes, also beaver and otter. The last now are very plenty. One of the men killed one of them with a setting pole. The latter part of the evening, Mark's route lay over hilly and mountainous country, covered with the sharp fragments of flint, which cut and bruised their feet excessively, nor were the prickly pear of the levelest part of the route much less painful. They have now become so abundant in the open uplands, it's impossible to avoid them. And their thorns are so keen and stiff that they pierce the double thickness of dressed skins with ease. Captain Clark informed me that he extracted 17 of these briars from his feet this evening after being encamped by the light of fire. I have guarded, or rather fortified, my feet against them by soling my moccasins with the hide of buffalo and parchment. He camped on the river, much fatigued, having passed 2 mountains in the course of the day, traveled about 30 miles, Captain Meriwether Lewis. So so you can understand what they're doing, they're wearing moccasins, and deer moccasins are worn very quickly. They have to put new soles on them every few days because they wear so quickly. What Lewis is doing is putting in buffalo hide inside of his moccasins to make them thicker so that as they're walking on the prickly pear cactus, they don't come through the bottom of his soles. By the way, if you're in Helena, Montana, that's a great trip to take on a boat. They take you upriver and you come back down, put it on your list of things. So many people have the impression that Lewis and Clark and this expedition was just a bunch of hunters going west, just a group of guys. But nothing could be further from the truth. It's a military expedition led by 2 experienced officers. They have a strict regimen of military code that even though they're in the middle of nowhere, they have to follow. And there are severe punishments for breaking the rules. It's also a scientific expedition. Meriwether Lewis had gone to Jefferson's friends in Philadelphia before leaving to learn about taking readings for surveying, but also about plants and rivers. And so in many cases, as they're traveling, they give names to places. So the Jefferson, Gallatin, Madison, and Smith rivers, they are all important government officials in Washington. They all have rivers named after them. So the expedition here in this picture is now traveling south through western Montana and is out on the distance. You'll see there a very large view, which came to be known in the journals as Fort Mountain. We arose very early this morning, assigned the canoes and their loads, and had it put on board. We now found our vessels 8 in number, all heavily laden, notwithstanding our several deposits. Though it's true, we now have a considerable stock of dried meat and grease. We find it extremely difficult to keep the baggage of many of our men within reasonable bounds. They keep adding bulky items of but little use or value. So you can imagine they're carrying buffalo robes or rocks or whatever that they're finding. And at 10 a.m., we once more saw ourselves fairly underway, much to my joy, and I believe that of every individual who composed the party. We have now passed Fort Mountain on our right. It appears to be about 10 miles distance. This mountain has a singular appearance. It is situated on a level plain. Its sides stand nearly at right angles with each other and are each about a mile in extent. These are formed of a yellow clay only without the mixture of rock or stone of any size and rise perpendicular to the height of 300 feet. The top appears to be a level plain, and from that eminence on which I was yesterday, I could see that it's covered with a similar cost of grass to the plain in which it stands. And on the surface appears to be a tolerable fertile mold of 2 feet thick, and it is to all appearance inaccessible. And from its figure, we gave the name Fort Meriwether Lewis. They were also looking for places to place forts, settlements as they're traveling west. have to digress for a moment. So when I got to Montana, I invited my niece, Lauren, to travel with me for 9 days through Montana. He was 22, graduate of nursing school back home in New Jersey. And I said to her that if she was going to come with me, she had to read about Lewis and Clark every day, only about Lewis and Clark, go to Lewis and Clark sites and keep a graduate or keep a journal as well. She is the oldest of my sister's children. She's a type A personality as I am, and she's a little too bossy. And having spent 9 days with her, but she was well-deserving vacation. She just got done with school. Her parents flew her out. And as I said, I only had a couple rules for her, but one of them was that she could not wear Crocs or flip-flops. You know, kids. And I said, you cannot do this out in Montana where we're going. And so she stepped up to the task pretty wonderfully and got really into this trip. She's a great traveler anyway. But we came to this place, the First Peoples Buffalo Jump State Park. And I don't know if you know what a buffalo jump is, but in Montana, there are about 150 buffalo jumps. And so what happens, herds of buffaloes are pushed over the edges or run over the edges of cliffs, and drop 100, 200, 300 feet down, and they're killed in the process, and then they're harvested from there for clothing, shoes, food storage, whatever, teepees. So when we got to the jump, I noticed that Lauren had changed into her very sensible shoes. And she was saddened by the fact that these buffalo got just pushed over the edge. Didn't think that was very nice. But what happens is there's a kid who's wearing a buffalo robe, who bleats like a little buffalo, and he runs over to that edge, and everybody keeps following him. And there's this pyramid of stone, and they run right down to the edge of the pyramid, the point of the pyramid, and then he jumps over that edge to a ledge, and all the buffalo follow over him. So this is what Lauren had to write. He said, we stopped at a buffalo jump in Ulm. We pulled off the highway and drove several miles until we reached the museum. And after going through the interpretive center, we drove a few more miles up to the jump. We got out and walked to the cliff, and the whole time I thought about the poor buffalo that had no idea what was going to happen to them. I did, however, feel a little relieved knowing that the Indians used every part of the buffalo, whether for food, shelter, or tools. The Indians respected the buffalo greatly and referred to them as uncle because they played such an important part. Oops. It's now the summer of 1805. The expedition has made it through 3 of the ranges of the Rockies. They're anxious to get past the Rockies because they know snow is coming. And Thomas Jefferson had presumed that the Rockies were going to be very similar to the Appalachians back east. They're not anywhere near what these are here. The captains are stunned, really, and I think that's the right word to see, that this is what they see when they get to the Lemhi Pass, which is on the Idaho-Montana border. They're increasingly worried about getting west, getting horses to go west, and meeting with the Shoshone Indians. And the Shoshone tribe is where Sacagawea has come from. And she's married, as I mentioned earlier, to Sazant Charbonneau. And now they're at the Lemhi Pass, and they've actually gotten to one of their goals of the trip, and that is to get to the source of the Missouri River. So at a distance of 4 miles, this is on August 12th, 1805. We're now coming in on Meriwether Lewis's journals. At the distance of 4 miles further, the road took us to the most distant fountain of the waters of the mighty Missouri, in such of which we have spent so many toilsome days and restless nights. Thus far, I had accomplished one of those great objects which my mind has been inalterably fixed for many years. Judge then of the pleasure I felt allaying my thirst with this pure and ice-cold water which issues from the base of a low mountain for a hill of a gentle ascent of a half a mile. The mountains are high on either hand and leave this gap at the head of this rivulet through which a road passes. And here I halted a few minutes and rested myself. 2 miles below, McNeil, one of the men on the expedition, had exultingly stood with 1 foot on each side of the little rivulet and thanked his God that he had lived to bestride the mighty and deemed previously the endless Missouri. And after refreshing ourselves, we proceeded on to the top of the dividing ridge, in which I discovered some immense range of mountains. And so that's what he saw when he got up there. And you can imagine how disappointed and perhaps concerned he was when he saw that. Just on the other side of this hill, he tasted the first water of the Columbia River. Oops, I'm sorry. And there I am standing at the very beginning of the Missouri River, and that it just comes out of the ground right there. And if you've been to St. Louis or you've been to any of those downstream, you can imagine how wide it is, how deep it is, and here I am standing where it all. We now come on one of the most, I think this may be the most amazing moments of the whole trip. Even a Hollywood producer would be reluctant to do this. And that is, once Lewis crosses over the Lemhi Pass, he meets two Shoshone women, and he arranges for a conference between their chief, Chief Kamawet, and himself on the park. To do this conversation between Kamawet and Lewis and Clark, it had to go through 4 interpreters. You had to go from Shoshone to Hidatsa, which is where Sacagawea had been in North Dakota, the French to English. So just imagine just trying to have a conversation with somebody. You can say 3 words and they go down that line. Sacagawea, as I mentioned, had been a member of this tribe. He'd been kidnapped from the Shoshone by the Hidatsas 5 years before. And so we come in on a description that was written later by William Clark after he was back. But it says, after this conference was to be opened, that is a conference between the Shoshone and Lewis and Clark, was to be open, and glad of the opportunity to be able to converse more intelligently, Sacagawea, or as it's known in Wyoming as Sacagawea, was sent for, and she came to the tent, sat down, and was beginning to interpret when, in the person of Kamawea, she recognized her brother. She instantly jumped up and ran and embraced him, throwing over him her blanket and weeping profusely. The chief himself was moved, though not in the same degree. After some conversation between them, she resumed her seat and attempted to interpret for us, but her new situation seemed to overpower her, and she was frequently interrupted by her tears. After the council was finished, the unfortunate woman learned that all of her family were dead, except 2 brothers, one of whom was absent, and the son of her eldest sister, a small boy, who was immediately adopted by her. After that meeting there up on the Lemhi, they were able to get the horses that they needed to go west. And so then they move farther up into the valley, the Bitterroot Valley, and here they meet the Flathead Indians. And you can see Charlie Russell is a great Western painter. Many of you know about him. But to the right, he's got the expedition very small, painted off to the side, whereas the native peoples are front and center. So the expedition is now moving to east of the Bitterroots, going north into Montana, western Montana. They find an ancient trail to get them over the mountains into the Pacific. And a couple of these excerpts were written in September 1805. I hiked through here, and I still marvel at my courage for doing this, because this is grizzly bear country, and you just don't want to be walking alone through there, but I did. And this is west of Missoula, Montana today. And so they have come from eating buffalo every day. They were eating the equivalent of 32 quarter-pounders every day. Now they're down to eating very little amounts of food, and they're trying to get over these mountains. So a cloudy day in the valleys, it rained and hailed. On top of the mountain, some snow. We crossed Glade Creek above its mouth at a place that the Flathead Indians have made 2 weirs to catch salmon, and have been utterly left now and gone. But here we were compelled to kill a colt for our men and ourselves to eat. And for the want of meat, we named the South Fork Colt Killed Creek, and you can still see that today in western town. And then the river we call the Flathead River. The mountains which we passed today, much worse than yesterday, excessively bad, thickly strewed with falling timber and pine spruce, and steep and stony, our men and horses much fatigue. That's William Clark's speech. They were actually there in September, and this is what it looked like as they were crossing over those mountains. And there was more than a foot of snow on the ground. And so on September 16th, began to snow about 3 hours before day, continued all day. The snow in the morning, 4 inches deep on the old snow. And by night, we found it 6 to 8 inches deep. I walked in front to keep the road and found great difficulty in keeping it in many places as the snow had entirely filled up the track. At 12 o'clock, we halted on the top of a mountain to warm and dry ourselves a little. And as well to let our horses rest and graze a little on some long grass. And this is Clark writing, so covered with snow, trees, that in passing through them, we were continually covered with snow. I have been wet and as cold in every part as I have ever been in my life. And indeed, I was at one time fearful that my feet would freeze, the thin moccasins which I wore. After a short delay in the middle of the day, I took one man and proceeded on as fast as I could, about 6 miles to a small branch, and we created fires and cooked meat, killed a second colt, which we were all supped heartily on, thought it fine meat. This was the most, and it was a time that William Clark would use the word dangerous several times in his entries. One of the Private Joseph Whitehouse wrote about this moment. This is kind of this week or two there going over the Bitterroots are kind of my interest in this expedition because it says much about commanders. But Private Whitehouse said, our party seemed revived at the success that the hunters had met with. However, in all the hardship they had yet undergone, they never once complained, trusting Providence in the conduct of our officers and all of our difficulties. And understand, I mean, if you were one of those 33 people, you might have said, I'm not doing this. This is crazy. We're going to die out. But they did not. They trusted Lewis and Clark. They come out of the Rockies into Nez Perce country. Another amazing story that happens. There's a Native American woman who sees the expedition coming for them. They're starving, but they have the greatest arsenal west of the Mississippi River right now. And that Native woman said, don't kill these men. And they did not. The Nez Perce did not. Fed them, got them back to health, and she died 3 days later. Just one of those amazing stories. And they proceed down the Clearwater, Snake, Columbia rivers through what is now Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and arrive in the Pacific in the closing days. On November 7th, in 1805, the expedition gets to the Pacific Ocean. This quote is probably the most famous quote in the journals. Ocean in view. That's Clark's spelling of ocean, I might add. Oh, the joy. Great joy in camp. We are in view of the ocean, this great Pacific Ocean, OCTAN, which we have been so anxious to see. The roaring or noise made by the waves breaking on the rocky shores may be heard distinctly, being made 34 miles. They settle at Port Clatsop after a vote of every member, including York, who was William Clark's slave, and Sacagawea. It's the first time in American history that a woman will vote, a slave would vote. It's agreed to proceed to the southern shore of the Columbia River. They built this fort. They had a hard time with the native peoples that were there. In the spring, they left, and William Clark wrote in March of 1806, although we have not fared sumptuously this winter and spring at Fort Clatsop, named for the native peoples there, we have lived quite as comfortably as we had any reason to expect we should, and accomplished every object which induced our remaining at this place, except that of meeting with the traders who visit the river. Our salt will be sufficient to last us to the desert. They had hoped to get a British or American clipper ship out there to take them home. They didn't want to have to walk all the way back as they had done, and that did not happen. They had a blank check from Thomas Jefferson to pay for all of that to go back east, but they couldn't. So they leave, they cross back over the Rockies. As they're coming down the Yellowstone, the group is split into two different groups, very controversial move by both Lewis and Clark. Lewis would even get tangled up with three Blackfeet Indians whom he killed. Only native peoples to be killed on the expedition, only violent altercation between the native peoples. And at that point, they both made their way down the Yellowstone, Missouri, and met where the Yellowstone and Missouri meet in northeast Montana. Once they get back together again, they return to St. Louis on September 26, 1806. And this is coming in on Clark's final entry, and he writes, "We delayed a short time." This is now coming down the Mississippi, or Missouri, I'm sorry. And at about 12 o'clock, we arrived at the site of St. Louis, fired 3 rounds as we approached the town, and landed opposite the center of town. And the people gathered on the shore and huzzaed with 3 cheers. We unloaded the canoes and drew them out. And the party all considerably much rejoiced that we had the expedition complete. And then writes at the end of that, finish, our parents were once more, our parents will be glad now to see us again, so long from. Just quickly, 2 other pieces of the puzzle. Sacagawea, which is how we would say it today, most of us. But if you were Native American in Wyoming or in North Dakota, you would say Sacagawea. She's a fascinating person. When I went on this expedition, I was really focused on her and Lewis and Clark. And what I found was that there's very little information about her. Aside from her being written about in the journals, there's almost nothing known about her, other than that she was a Shoshone. So when they get to the Pacific, this huge whale comes up on the beach, and a number of the men go out to see it. And she wanted to go out and see it. She had been the first woman to vote in the American history. She was called Janie in the journal. She was also called Indian Woman. She was critically important to the expedition. Many people have said, well, she guided the journey. That's not true. But because she was there with a baby, every time Native people saw her, they realized that it was not a war party, because women and babies did not go on war parties. But she also helped them find food to eat during the course of that trip. And most importantly, she was able to get them hooked into where the Shoshones were. She recognized where they were and got them to come away. So they discover this large dead whale. This is one of the few times that she makes it into the journals in a detailed kind of way. So here's how Meriwether Lewis described this commotion that was raised by Sacagawea. Captain Clark set out after an early breakfast with the party in 2 canoes, as had been concerted that last evening. Charbonneau and his Indian women were also of the party. The Indian woman was very impatient to be permitted to go, and was therefore indulged. She observed that she had traveled a long way with us to see the great waters, and now that monstrous fish was also to be seen, and she thought it very hard that she could not be permitted to see either. Well, go girl! And so she went out there and saw that. And that's one of them. There are numerous monuments to her across the whole West. This is one of the ones that I thought was the most beautiful. This is out in Oregon. Another person that you should know a little bit about was York. He was William Clark's slave. He had been a slave since he was a boy. Both of them had been boys together. I think he thought, and thought he was deserving of to be released, to be free after the expedition, because he was treated like a regular member. He carried a gun. He helped Clark all the way through. So we come in 1804. You can see York standing in the center there. They're at an Indian village, and here's what's written. The Indians, much astonished by my black servant, who made himself more terrible in their view than I wished him to do, as I'm told, telling them that before I caught him, he was wild and lived upon people, and young children were very good eating. Showed them his strength, etc. Those Indians are not fond of liquor of any kind. So that's how York figures into the journals, although he's mentioned more frequently. And there's a statue of him there in Louisville. To kind of finish up, one of the things that struck me is how the lives ended for both of these men. They'd faced down grizzlies, faced down the Sioux. They'd nearly starved to death through the Rockies together. Had seen all this incredible country. And of course, there's that famous poem by Walt Whitman, "Oh Captain, my Captain," you might remember. And I've thought often about how that poem reflects on Meriwether Lewis. He's dead within 3 years of the expedition. He shot himself in Natchez Trace in Tennessee. Some now believe, many historians now believe he was actually murdered there. But he was going back to Washington to counter charges of financial mismanagement of the aftermath of the expedition. He'd suffered long and hard from depression and alcoholism. And as he's dying there in Tennessee on the Natchez Trace, the tradition has it, the woman who was interviewed who heard this said, "Clark will come and get him." And that was 3 years after the expedition. He still did not sleep in beds at that time. He slept on bear skins on the floor of that log cabin. And Clark, I should also say, went on to a tremendous career, married twice. I think he had 13 children. He became the governor of Missouri, the head of Indian affairs in the western part of the country, and lived a long life until the 80s. And that's his monument there in St. Louis. And then the one on the left is, if I remember my graveyard art column thing, that's a broken column, and that indicates that life is broken off in the middle of it. So that's why it looks like broken. William Clark was not identified when he was buried. He was put in the ground, but someone there remembered him being buried there in that little town. And so 30 or 40 years later, Tennessee agreed to put a monument there, which this monument is. They dug up around the cemetery and they found somebody in a full dress uniform, and they realized that's Meriwether Lewis. So he is buried there. There's been discussion about getting him back to Virginia, but this is within a national park. There's even been discussion about exhuming him to do an autopsy on him, but none of that has happened because it's a national park. And then lastly on these journals, as I mentioned, they were not published until 1814. And I mention that because Nicholas Biddle from Philadelphia kind of put a narrative together, but it was not the actual journals themselves. And so that was the public's first kind of exposure to the Lewis and Clark expedition, lengthy book. Elliott Coues, who had traveled extensively in the same areas that Lewis and Clark did, published the journals as he saw it in 1893. He actually cut snippets out of the actual journals themselves and taped them together or whatever. But he was a secretary and naturalist to the U.S. Geological Boundary Survey, and he publishes what are known as the Coues edition. And then in 1901, Reuben Thwaites, and that's the version that's over there now, was compiled by him. He's a historian with Wisconsin, And so his version, and you'll see if you look at the beginning of it, it'll say dedicated to Theodore Roosevelt. That's the copy that Theodore Roosevelt actually read as president. And then finally in 2003, Bernard DeVoto, some of you might remember him in high school. Bernard DeVoto, great Western historian, compiled an abridged version of it. And then the last, Gary Moulton, who was with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, undertook this a massive effort to digitize all the journals, which you can now see online. It's a wonderful thing that our state university system did this, because in the early 2000s, they were getting ready for the bicentennial of the expedition, and all the other states refused to take money to do this, didn't want to be involved. Montana, which is where they were the longest, did not want to be a part of this, but the University of Nebraska did. And so this is often called the Nebraska edition. But when you go home and you're Googling around tonight, the web page is there that you can just pick a day and go to. And it was probably one of the greatest history projects ever undertaken. And then lastly, I love these two quotes. One is that Meriwether Lewis writes to Thomas Jefferson, "We embarked with our baggage on a voyage of discovery to the Pacific Ocean." How they could have known what those 8,000 miles of mountains, the plains, all the things we saw. And then when Meriwether Lewis, it was announced that Meriwether Lewis was dead, Thomas Jefferson wrote this wonderful note about it. There's an obituary, because Jefferson and Clark both believed that Lewis had committed suicide. There was no doubt in their mind that had happened. So this is that story of Jefferson. So as I say, it's one of the great moments of American history. Now, if you are Native American, you'll not agree with that. At the Sacagawea Museum there in Salmon, Idaho, there is this exhibit about her. There's very little known, except for the time that she was on the expedition, very little known about her life. There is a teepee there that's set up in the way that she would have set it up. And on the wall are visitors' comments, cards, and almost all of them had the same kind of sentiment to them, and that is that something like Sacagawea was the one who led to the genocide of Native American people. Remember, she was 15 years old, married to Sacagawea, and was taken as a prisoner. And how she could have led to what became this catastrophe for Native people in the West, it's fair or accurate. But I will say that the Native American contribution to this expedition has always been understated. And without the Native peoples, the Nez Perce, the Shoshone, you pick the tribe, because they went through any number of tribes in that expedition. Every single one of those tribes, except for the Sioux, were friendly, helped them, gave them food, helped them get to where they had to go. The Nez Perce saved them when they came out of the Rocky Mountains. Without the Native people, the expedition could have never happened. And of course, Sacagawea was a so. Well, thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them for you. I know it was a little long, but these are all some of my favorite quotes from journals.
Okay, so they divided it up on the way back home
Yes.
along the. So what was the purpose of that?
So it's hard, I can't show you without, actually, if you look at the map on the back of that first page, what happens is Meriwether Lewis wants to get as far north as he can, almost to what would be the Canadian border today. He wants to get there so the United States can claim land. So he wants to get to the northernmost boundary. William Clark wants to follow the Yellowstone because it's a lot easier to get, they don't have to do the Great Falls again, and they can get around. So they decided to split the expedition in half. It's a very controversial decision. They had made every right decision up until then, but the break in half after the east of the Rockies made no sense. Even today, historians argue about it. But by doing that, Meriwether Lewis did get quite a ways up to almost to Canadian. And Clark saw then the Yellowstone River, which had not been seen, not by Eastern America, Native people. But that's why they split. Then they were going to meet at the junction of the Yellowstone and Missouri. And Clark had left a note, because he waited a couple days, and he left a note on a stick, said, hey, we're already gone, so come on and catch up with us. And a beaver ate the stick in the note. So Meriwether Lewis continued on, they finally caught up. And during that time, Meriwether Lewis had been shot in the butt by one of his men by accident. They thought it was an attack. And so he was shot. And so he was laying prostrate in this bark canoe. And William Clark goes over to him and he's laying there. He couldn't get up because he was shot. But anyway, he recovered from that and on. But that's why they split. They thought they'd explore more territory. And as I say, Meriwether Lewis could claim farther to the north. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you. I think I'm done with the trilogy.
You are. Until next year,
No
right?
more dead people.